Victor Harlan walked into the crowded saloon that Tuesday morning, grabbed the old rancher by the collar, and dragged him across the floor in front of his own wife and children. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Because in Blackstone Crossing, you didn't speak against Victor Harlan. You didn't look at him wrong. You didn't even breathe too loud when he was in a room. The old man, Thomas Briggs, 62 years old, 3 decades on that land, hit the floor hard, and Victor crouched down over him and said, very quietly, so quiet you almost had to lean in to hear it, "Sign it, or I burn every fence post you own." And across the room, pressed against the far wall with a worn suitcase at her feet and exactly $42 in her coat pocket, a woman named Clara Winslow watched the whole thing. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just watched. And something settled in her chest. Not fear. Something colder than fear and much more dangerous. If you've ever stood in a room where wrong was happening right in front of you and felt that pull, that quiet, furious question of what do I do, then you already understand exactly who Clara Winslow is. This is her story, and I promise you, it is not the story you think it is. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel tells the kind of stories that stay with you. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. Part 1 starts right now. Clara Winslow had made a habit, most of her life, of arriving places where she wasn't wanted. She'd been doing it since she was 7 years old, when her mother dragged her from one failing homestead to the next across 3 territories, always chasing some promise that never quite materialized. She'd done it at 17 when she walked into a schoolhouse in Tulsa and asked for a teaching position with no credentials and a dress that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric. She'd done it at 24 when she married a man who turned out to be someone else entirely than the person she'd believed him to be. She was 31 now. She had $42, a suitcase with a broken latch held shut by a leather belt, and a single letter of reference from a schoolmaster in Denver who had written, in his careful handwriting, that Claire possessed uncommon intelligence and a stubbornness that would serve her well in difficult circumstances. She had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Blackstone Crossing was not what she'd imagined from the advertisement. The posting had described a frontier community with opportunity for capable individuals. What she found when the stage rolled in at just past noon on a Wednesday in October was a main street with more boarded windows than open ones, a saloon that appeared to do most of its business before midday, and a general store where the man behind the counter looked up at her when she walked in and then looked back down again without speaking, as if acknowledging her presence was more than he could afford. She asked him where she might find Ronan Mercer's ranch. The man behind the counter set down his pencil. He looked at her again, really looked, this time the way people had been looking at Clara her entire life, with that particular mixture of pity and confusion, trying to figure out what category she belonged in. She was tall for a woman. Her face was angular in a way that people sometimes called handsome and sometimes called severe depending on their mood. She had a scar along her left jaw from a fall at age 9 that she had long since stopped trying to explain or conceal. Her clothes were clean but clearly traveled in. "You got business with Mercer?" the man asked. "I applied for the housekeeper position," Clara said. He wrote back, "I have the letter." The storekeeper studied her for a moment that stretched about 3 beats longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "You sure about that?" "I have the letter right here," Clara said again, patiently. "That ain't what I asked." She held his gaze. "Then say what you mean." He picked his pencil back up. "Mercer Ranch is 4 miles north. Stay on the road, don't cut through the Harlan property on the west side, and don't stop at the creek crossing if you see horses you don't recognize." He paused. "That's free advice. Costs extra to explain it." Clara thanked him and left. She was halfway up the main street, suitcase in her right hand, when she heard the commotion from the saloon. The doors were open. They were always open in these towns, she had noticed, as if the buildings themselves were trying to breathe. And what came through those open doors was not the usual dull roar of mid-morning drinking. It was a sharp collective silence, the kind that forms around something bad. She stopped. She should not have stopped. She knew that even as she did it. She looked through the doorway. A man she would later learn was named Thomas Briggs was on the floor. He was a thick man, built like someone who had spent his life doing physical work, and he looked entirely wrong on the ground, the way a large tree looks wrong after it falls, reduced somehow, diminished from what it was meant to be. He was holding his elbow where he'd caught himself on the way down, and his face was a complicated map of pain and shame and something else. Something Clara recognized immediately because she had felt it herself. The particular humiliation of being made small in front of people you know. The man standing over him was not especially large. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Victor Harlan, she didn't know his name yet, but she would come to recognize that posture anywhere, was maybe 5'11", well-dressed in a way that announced money rather than earned it, with the easy, relaxed stance of a man who had not been physically challenged in a very long time because the people around him had learned better. He crouched down and said something she couldn't quite make out. Thomas Briggs's wife was pressed against the bar with their daughter, a girl of maybe 10 or 11, and the girl was very still in the way that children go still when they are trying not to make anything worse. Clara stood in the doorway and watched all of this. And the thing that stayed with her, the thing she would think about for months afterward, was not what Victor Harlan did. It was what everyone else in that room was doing, which was nothing. There were 14, 15 people in that saloon. Grown men, a few women. None of them were looking directly at what was happening. They were studying their drinks, examining the ceiling, finding something very interesting to contemplate on the far wall. The collective effort of not seeing was almost athletic in its intensity. Clara had spent enough of her life learning when not to get involved in things that weren't her business. She watched a grown man on the floor being humiliated in front of his child, and she made a note in the back of her mind. Not a dramatic resolution, nothing like that, just a small, quiet notation, the kind you make when you encounter a fact that will matter later. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked on up the road. The Mercer Ranch was exactly 4 miles north, as the storekeeper had said, and it did not look like a place where someone had given up, which was the first thing Clara noticed and the first thing that surprised her. She had half expected decay. The advertisement had a quality of desperation around the edges that sometimes indicated a household in genuine disarray. But the fences were standing, the outbuildings were weathered but intact, and the main house was solid in the way that old, well-built things are solid. Not pretty, not impressive, but genuinely there. What the ranch looked like, she decided, was tired. Ronan Mercer met her on the porch. He was not what she had pictured either, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had pictured. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and the particular physical presence of someone who had spent years doing work that demanded everything from his body. He had a stillness about him that she associated with either great self-control or great exhaustion, and she suspected it might be both. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm Clara Winslow. I have your letter." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "Why not?" He glanced at her suitcase, then back at her face. "Because I told you in that letter what the situation is here. Most people read that kind of letter and find work somewhere else." Clara set her suitcase down on the bottom porch step. She had, in fact, read that letter approximately 40 times. It had been very straightforward. The job, the pay, the basic expectations. And then at the end, in a paragraph that seemed to have cost him something to write, he had described the difficulty. "There is ongoing conflict with a neighboring party that has created an unsafe environment. I am telling you this plainly because I will not have someone come here under false pretenses." This is not a peaceful posting. She had read it and thought, good. She was tired of peaceful postings. Peaceful postings had a way of becoming something else anyway. "I read it," she said. "I'm here." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. "You'll want to see the house," he said. "I'll want to know about the conflict first," she said. He went very still. "The letter mentioned it," she said before he could say anything. "I'm not asking out of curiosity. If I'm going to manage this household effectively, I need to understand what I'm managing around. That seems practical to me." Ronan Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down on the porch steps. Not offered her a seat, not invited her in, just sat down on the steps like a man whose legs had decided for him. And he said, "Victor Harlan has been buying land in this valley for 6 years. Not buying, exactly. He makes offers that aren't really offers. When people don't take them, Things happen. Fences get cut, water gets diverted, barns catch fire. He paused. I've been his last holdout for about 8 months. What does he want your land for specifically? Ronan blinked. The water rights. The creek that runs through my property is the cleanest source in the valley. Controls the creek, he controls everything west of the ridge. And the authorities? The sound he made was not quite a laugh. The county sheriff and Harlan went to school together. The territorial office is 200 miles away and has 17 open cases. The last man who filed a formal complaint against Harlan found his horses loose on the road and one of his ranch hands in the hospital. Clara absorbed this. You have documentation of any of it? Some. Not enough. Who do you employ here? 3 hands. Good men. Been with me since before... He stopped. Been with me a long time. She noticed the stop, filed it away. The pay you offered in the letter, she said. Is that still the offer? It is. I'll take the position, Clara said. But I want to say something first, Mr. Mercer, and I'd appreciate you hearing it plainly. He waited. I am not here to be managed or protected or kept ignorant for my own safety. I have been managed and protected and kept ignorant in other situations, and it did not serve anyone well. If there's trouble coming, I want to know about it when you know about it. Not after. Not softened. She picked up her suitcase. Is that going to be a problem? Ronan Mercer looked at her for the 3rd long measuring time in as many minutes. No, he said. I don't think it is. Whoa. The house was exactly as tired as the ranch. Not dirty. Someone had been maintaining it, though without much heart, but stripped of the 1,000 small details that make a house a home rather than a shelter. Bare walls where pictures had been taken down or never hung. A kitchen where everything worked but nothing was where it should naturally be, as if someone had put things away without knowing where they belonged. A dining table that seated 8 with 2 chairs pulled up to it. The housekeeper before her, she learned from the youngest of the ranch hands, a red-faced young man named Pete, who clearly had not learned yet when not to talk, had stayed 3 weeks before Victor Harlan had a word with her in town, and she'd been on the next stage out. The one before that had lasted 10 days. Mr. Mercer don't talk about it much, Pete said, watching her reorganize the kitchen with what appeared to be a mixture of admiration and mild anxiety. He just kind of keeps going. That's usually what people do, Clara said. Yes, ma'am, but... Pete stopped himself. She waited. His wife, Pete said. She passed. 18 months ago. Fever. And after that, Harlan started really pushing, like he figured Mr. Mercer was soft enough now to... He caught himself again, as if hearing how it sounded. I shouldn't have said that. You're fine, Clara said. Mr. Mercer's not soft, Pete said, with the particular fierceness of someone defending someone they admire. He's just carrying a lot, Clara said. Pete blinked. Yeah, that's it exactly. She found the accounting books that evening in a desk in the small room off the main parlor that Ronan apparently used as an office. She didn't go looking for them. They were simply there, stacked somewhat haphazardly on the desk corner, and she was reorganizing the room and the top one fell open and she caught it. She stood there for a moment, reading. The ranch was not in ruins. It was not, as she had half feared, some romantic lost cause she was about to pour herself into for nothing. The land was good, and the cattle numbers were solid, and Ronan Mercer was not, by any measure, a bad businessman. But there were gaps, small decisions that had been made in the last 18 months that weren't quite wrong but weren't quite right either. The kind of decisions you make when you're keeping yourself upright through sheer will, and some things slip through because you don't have the attention to spare. A contract renewed without renegotiation. Feed ordered at a rate that made sense for a larger operation than this one currently was. 3 small expenses that should have been caught earlier. She closed the book carefully and put it back where she'd found it. It was not her place to bring it up. Not yet. She had been here 8 hours. But she stood in that doorway a moment longer, looking at the desk, at the handwriting in those ledgers that told its own story about a man trying to hold on to something that meant everything to him, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel this quickly in a new place. She felt like she was supposed to be here. That was a dangerous feeling. She knew that. It had gotten her into trouble before, but she'd also learned, at 31, that the dangerous feelings were sometimes the ones worth paying attention to. The first real trouble came 4 days in. She was in the yard just before sunrise, carrying water from the well, when she heard hooves on the road, not the usual sound of horses moving with purpose, but the slow, deliberate sound of horses moving to be seen. 2 of them. Men she didn't recognize, sitting easy in their saddles, not doing anything in particular except being present on the road that ran along the eastern fence line. They weren't on Mercer property. They were just there. She set the water bucket down and stood in the yard and looked at them. They looked back. One of them touched the brim of his hat in a way that was somehow not a greeting. She went inside and found Ronan in the kitchen with his first cup of coffee. 2 men on the east road, she said, sitting, not moving. He didn't look surprised, he just looked tired. How long? I don't know, they were there when I came out. They'll ride away in an hour or so, he said. It's just, I know what it is, Clara said. I'm telling you I saw them so you know that I know. He looked up at her over the coffee cup. Also, she said, setting the water down, I'd like to start keeping a record. Dates, times, descriptions of anyone or anything that's not where it should be. Every incident, however small. She met his eyes. I know you've been managing this for months, and you have your own way of dealing with it. I'm not saying your way is wrong. I'm saying this is what I can do that might help. Ronan was quiet for a moment. There's a journal in the desk, he said. I'll use a separate one, Clara said. It should be separate. If it ever needs to go somewhere official, it should be clearly its own document. He looked at her for a long moment. Where'd you learn to think like that? Expensive experience, Clara said, and poured her own coffee. The 2 men on the road rode away at 7:30, exactly as Ronan had said they would. Clara stood at the window and watched them go, and then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote the first entry in a new journal, describing what she had seen with the date, the time, the direction they'd come from, and the direction they left in, and the fact that they had not spoken and had not technically violated any law she could name. She wrote, purpose, intimidation, effect on household, noted and filed. She underlined filed. Victor Harlan came to the ranch himself on the 9th day. She had not expected that. She had expected another variety of the indirect, the men on the road, the rumors in town she was already hearing about Mercer's new situation, the way people at the general store had begun looking at her with a particular combination of pity and calculation. She had not expected the man himself to simply ride up to the front gate in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon as if he were paying a social call. He was, she realized, watching him from the window, exactly what she had guessed from the saloon. He moved like a man who had never seriously had to wonder what would happen if someone said no to him. Not cruel in his face, that was the thing. He looked pleasant enough in an expensive, groomed sort of way. The cruelty was in the ease of him. Ronan went out to the gate. Clara went to the porch. She should have stayed inside, she knew that. There was no tactical advantage to being visible right now. But something in her refused. That same refusal that had stood in the saloon doorway and not looked away. And she stood on the porch with her arms at her sides and listened. Victor Harlan looked at her across the yard. A small, evaluating look. Then he returned his attention to Ronan. Heard you brought someone in, Victor said. Didn't figure you for the type to need help holding things together. She manages the house, Ronan said. His voice was flat and careful. Course she does. Victor's gaze moved back to Clara briefly, almost as an afterthought. Mercer, I want you to hear me clearly. I'm prepared to increase my offer by 20%, one time. What I'm not prepared to do is go on having this conversation indefinitely. My answer is the same as it's been. Your answer, Victor said, with patient, practiced reasonableness, is going to cost you more than you're prepared to pay. He let that sit for a moment. Think about what you're protecting, son. Think about whether it's worth it. The word son landed like it was meant to. Diminishing, dismissive, the verbal equivalent of what he'd done to Thomas Briggs on the saloon floor. Ronan said nothing. Victor touched the brim of his hat, the same gesture Clara noticed that his men used on the road, and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. There was a long silence. You shouldn't have been on the porch, Ronan said finally. No, Clara said. I shouldn't have. She went back inside and wrote everything down, every word she could remember, the exact phrasing of the offer, the phrasing of the threat, the fact that he'd looked at her and what that look had contained. She wrote, "He came himself." That means the indirect approach isn't working to his satisfaction. He needed to see the situation directly. He saw me and recalibrated. I could see it happen. She paused, then wrote, "He's going to want to know who I am." She underlined that too, and underneath it, after a moment's thought, she wrote, "Good." By the end of her second week at the Mercer Ranch, Claire had filled 11 pages of the journal, not with dramatic events. That was the thing nobody who hadn't lived inside this kind of pressure would understand. It wasn't dramatic, mostly. It was relentless in its smallness. A gate latch broken that had been fine the night before. A delivery from the feed store that arrived 3 days late with no explanation, and then, when Pete rode into town to ask about it, arrived the very next morning as if nothing had happened. A rumor that reached her through the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Adeline, who had taken a cautious, watchful interest in Clara that was not quite friendship, but was something. That Ronan Mercer was behind on his land taxes, which was not true. Clara had seen the receipts, but which was already moving through Blackstone Crossing like it was established fact. She wrote it all down, dates, times, sources where she had them. The exact words of the rumor as Adeline had reported it, with Adeline's name in parentheses and a note that the woman had not spread it, but had heard it at the dry goods counter from 2 separate people in one afternoon. Ronan watched her do this, the writing, the careful noting, the cross-referencing, and he said nothing for the first week and a half. Then one evening he sat down across from her at the kitchen table and said, "You think any of that's going to matter?" Clara looked up. "I think it might. I think it might not. But if it does, and I haven't been keeping it, there's no going back." He was quiet for a moment. "The county's not going to do anything. I told you about the sheriff." "I'm not thinking about the county," Clara said. "Then who are you thinking about?" "Territorial authorities. A judge who doesn't owe Victor Harlan any favors. Someone far enough away that his reach doesn't get there first." She set her pen down. "He's been operating in this valley for 6 years. That means he's made choices, left traces. Nobody runs something like this without eventually creating a record, even if they're careful. And men like him are usually not as careful as they think they are, because nobody's ever made them be careful before." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you actually come from, Clara?" It wasn't an unkind question. It was genuine. The kind of question that meant he'd been trying to figure something out and had decided to just ask. "Denver most recently," she said. "Before that, a few other places." "That's not what I mean." She picked her pen back up. "I know it's not." She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. "My husband was a man who made promises he couldn't keep, and then found ways to make sure I was the one who looked unreliable when they fell apart. I learned to document things because I needed there to be a version of events that wasn't just his word against mine." She said it evenly, without drama, the way you say something you've already fully processed. "I got good at it. Turns out it's a useful skill in more than one situation." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," Ronan said. "Don't be," Clara said. "It made me better at this than I would have been otherwise." He nodded slowly, and she could see him absorbing it. Not with pity, which she would not have tolerated, but with something that looked more like understanding. Then he said, "The accounting books. In the desk." She kept her face neutral. "Yes?" "You've looked at them." It was not a question. "One fell open when I was reorganizing," she said. "I looked at what was in front of me. I apologize if that was out of bounds." "It wasn't." He paused. "Was it bad?" "No," she said honestly. "It wasn't bad. There are 3 places where I'd have made different decisions, but they're not catastrophic. The feed contract needs renegotiating when it comes up in the spring. You're overpaying by about 12% based on current rates and your actual usage." She paused. "I can show you if you want." He stared at her. "The accounting is part of managing a household effectively," she said. "If the household is financially undermined, I can't manage it." "That is," Ronan said slowly, "either the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in a year or the most terrifying. I haven't decided." Clara almost smiled. She caught it in time, mostly. "Probably both," she said, and went back to writing. She met Thomas Briggs properly on a Saturday, 17 days after she arrived. He came to the ranch with his wife Margaret and their daughter Lily to return a borrowed piece of equipment, a fence stretcher Ronan had lent him the previous spring. And there was a careful formality to the visit that told Clara it was the first time he'd been here in a while. He moved like a man who'd been knocked down recently and was still deciding whether he was going to talk about it. Margaret Briggs was a different matter. She was a small, precise woman in her early 50s who took one look at Clara and then looked at the kitchen and then looked back at Clara and said, very quietly, "You're still here." "I am," Clara said. 3 weeks. Almost 4. Margaret nodded slowly, as if this were data she was adding to an existing calculation. Then she said, "Do you have coffee made?" They sat at the kitchen table while the men talked in the yard, and Lily, who was 11 and had the watchful eyes of a child who had seen too many adult conversations go bad, sat at the far end of the table and read a school primer with her finger moving along the lines. Margaret told her about Blackstone Crossing in the way that women who have lived somewhere for a long time talk about it. Not the official version, not the version you tell a stranger, but the real one, with its fault lines and its loyalties and its small betrayals. Who owned what? Who owed who what? Which families had sold to Harlan and which hadn't, and what it had cost each of them to make either choice. "The Kellermans left in June," Margaret said. "Phelan and Dorothea, 22 years on that land. He didn't even raise his voice at them. That's the thing people don't understand about Victor. He doesn't have to. By the time he actually makes the offer, he's already arranged it so that everything around you is falling apart, and his offer is the only solid thing in reach." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "They sold for 40 cents on the dollar." "Did they sign anything that documented the pressure?" Clara asked. Margaret's mouth thinned. "Nobody signs anything documenting pressure. You don't even tell anyone while it's happening because you're afraid saying it out loud will make it worse." "I know," Clara said, "but would the Kellermans talk now, after the fact?" Margaret looked at her sharply. "What are you planning?" "I'm not planning anything yet," Clara said. "I'm asking questions." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at her in that same way Adeline had looked at her. Not quite trust, but something that was considering whether trust was possible. Then she said, "Phelan might talk. He's been drinking more than he should since they left, and men who are drinking more than they should have a tendency to say the true thing they've been holding. Where are they now?" 3 miles east of town. They're staying with Dorothea's sister until they figure out what to do next." Margaret paused. "What exactly are you writing in that journal you carry around?" Clara had not thought anyone had noticed the journal. She recalibrated. "Everything that doesn't look right, everything that feels like a pattern." "And what do you think the pattern is?" "I think Victor Harlan has been running the same approach for 6 years, Clara said, "and it's worked every time because everyone he runs it against has dealt with it alone. They don't know what the person 2 miles over is experiencing because they're all too scared to say it out loud. So each family feels like they're the only ones, like it's something specific to them, like maybe if they had just done one thing differently." She stopped. "But it's not. It's the same approach, repeated. And the moment you can show that it's a pattern, not isolated incidents, it stops being just your word against his." Margaret Briggs put her coffee cup down very carefully. "My Thomas," she said, "hasn't slept a full night in 4 months." "I know," Clara said. She didn't know specifically, but she knew in the general way that you know things about men who have been publicly humiliated and are trying to carry it quietly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Margaret said, in an echo of what Clara had said to Ronan that was probably coincidental but landed anyway. "Just tell me what you need." What she needed, it turned out, was more than she'd initially thought, because the pattern, once she started pulling at it, was bigger than she'd imagined. It was one thing to suspect that Victor Harlan had applied the same pressure to multiple families. It was another thing to sit in the Kellermans' borrowed kitchen 2 days later and listen to Phelan Kellerman, a broad, worn man of 55 who still looked like he hadn't quite finished being surprised that his life had come to this, describe with careful, somewhat halting detail the exact sequence of events that had preceded his decision to sell. The late deliveries, the broken equipment, the rumors about financial trouble that weren't true but that somehow reached his bank. The two men who'd sat on the road at the edge of his property for 3 weeks and done nothing except be there. And then, at the end, when all of that had ground him down to a point where he wasn't sleeping and Dorothea was crying at night, and the daughter was asking questions he couldn't answer, Victor Harlan riding up like a reasonable man with a reasonable offer and a smile that said, "I know exactly how tired you are." Clara sat across from him and wrote everything down and asked her careful questions, and when she left, she had 6 pages in the journal and a feeling in her chest that was partly grim and partly something else, a kind of terrible clarity, the feeling you get when a thing that was blurry comes suddenly into focus. She visited 2 more families that week. The Hendersons, who hadn't sold yet but were 3 months into the same sequence the Kellermans had described, their oldest ranch hand having quit without explanation after what he obliquely described as a conversation in town that he didn't want to detail. And old Abel Marsh, who was 71 and had been on his land longer than any of them, and who had so far seemed impervious to Harlan's pressure, perhaps because Victor underestimated what it took to move a man who had already outlasted most of the things in his life that could have broken him. Abel sat with her on his porch and listened to her explain what she was doing with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has learned not to waste words on interruption. When she finished, he said, "You're going to get yourself hurt." "Maybe," Clara said, "but I think right now Victor Harlan doesn't know what I'm doing. He knows I exist. He doesn't know what I'm building." "What are you building?" "A case," she said. "A real one. Something that can go to territorial authorities with enough specificity that they can't dismiss it as a neighbor dispute." Abel looked out at his land for a moment. Then he said, "My son's a clerk with the Territorial Land Office in Harston. Been there 8 years. He glanced at her. "I mentioned that because you said you were thinking about territorial authorities." Clara felt something shift in her chest. "That's worth knowing," she said quietly. "I imagine it is," Abel said. He rocked his chair once. "You want some water before you ride back?" Victor Harlan made his next move 11 days after his visit to the ranch, and he made it in public, which told Clara something important about where his head was. She was at the general store. She had been coming into town once a week, deliberately, because disappearing from public view was exactly what he'd want. It isolated you, made you easier to ignore. When he came in with 2 of his men and stood at the counter and said something to the storekeeper, whose name was Gerald, in a voice that was just loud enough to be heard by everyone in the room. He said that he had it on good authority that Ronan Mercer was planning to sell the ranch within the month and move on, and that anyone who had done business with Mercer or extended credit should probably start thinking about protecting their interests. It was, Clara thought, watching from the dry goods aisle, elegant in its way, not a direct lie, or not one that could be easily pinned as intentional, just a piece of information casually offered that would do its work on its own if nobody corrected it. Within 48 hours, Ronan's credit at the feed store would be quietly questioned. The family that had an informal grazing agreement on the eastern pasture would start wondering if they should be talking to someone else. The ranch hand Ronan had been trying to hire for a month would hear it and decide to wait and see. Clara set down the bag of flour she'd been holding and walked to the counter. "Excuse me," she said. Victor Harlan turned and looked at her with that same small, recalibrating look he'd given her in the yard. "Mr. Mercer has no plans to sell," she said. She kept her voice even, matter of fact, as if she were correcting a simple misunderstanding about store hours. "If you've heard otherwise, I'd be curious about the source, because it's not accurate." The room was very quiet. Victor looked at her for a moment with an expression that was almost pleasant and said, "And you would know, Miss Winslow," she said. "And yes, I manage the financial accounts for the ranch. There's no sale under consideration, and the ranch's finances are stable." She looked at Gerald behind the counter. "If there are any questions about outstanding accounts, Mr. Mercer is happy to settle them in full at any time." Gerald blinked at her. No, there's no issue with his account, Miss Winslow. Always been settled on time." "Good," Clara said. "I'll take 2 pounds of flour and a spool of the brown thread, please." She could feel Victor Harlan's eyes on the back of her head while she waited for Gerald to wrap her purchases. She wrote the whole thing down when she got back to the ranch, including the specific claim Victor had made, the names of the 4 people besides Gerald, who she had identified as being in the store, and her own response word for word as best she could reconstruct it. Then she wrote, "He is testing what I'll do. Today I showed him I won't stay quiet. That will escalate things. I am aware of that, and I think it is the right choice anyway." She sat with that sentence for a moment, then left it. Ronan, when she told him that evening, went very still in the particular way he went still, when something had angered him, but he was not going to express it directly. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "He's going to focus on you now. He was already focused on me. He just wasn't sure what I was." She looked at him steadily. "Now he knows I'm not going to be invisible. That's actually better for us. It means he'll spend energy on me that he'd otherwise spend on the ranch hands or the neighbors." "Clara, I know what I'm doing," she said, and then, more quietly, "I know it doesn't always look like it. But I know." He was quiet for a long moment. There was something moving across his face that he wasn't giving words to. Then he said, "If anything happens to you because of this, then I'll deal with it," she said. "Same as you've been dealing with it." "That's not the same." "Why not?" He didn't answer, and the fact that he didn't answer sat in the room between them for a long moment before Clara picked up the journal and went to make sure the doors were locked, which was something she had started doing every night that she hadn't done the first week. Margaret Briggs came to the ranch on a Thursday with her daughter Lily and a jar of preserves and information she said she couldn't keep sitting on. 2 days after Clara's confrontation in the general store, one of Victor Harlan's men, the taller of the two who regularly rode the East Road, a man people called Danner, had approached Lily Briggs outside the schoolhouse. He had not touched her. He had not said anything threatening, exactly. He had asked her very politely how her father was getting along and whether the family was planning to stay in Blackstone Crossing much longer. Lily was 11 years old. Clara sat very still while Margaret told her this. She kept her face controlled because going cold and furious in front of a woman who was already frightened was not useful. "She wasn't hurt," Margaret said, as if she'd been repeating it to herself. "Nothing happened." "I know," Clara said. "Thomas wants to—" Margaret stopped. "He's talking about things I don't want him to do. Things that will only make it worse." "I understand," Clara said. "Margaret, I need you to do something. I need you to write down everything Lily told you about what Danner said to her, with the date and the time and where it happened, every word you remember. And I need Lily to do the same thing in her own handwriting, just exactly what she remembers." Margaret's jaw tightened. "She's 11. "I know, and what happened to her is what makes this something different than a neighbor dispute. What happened to her is what makes this the kind of thing a territorial authority can't ignore." Clara leaned forward slightly. "He's done this long enough that he thinks it's normal, that approaching a child is just another tool available to him. When you write it down, in a child's handwriting, with a date and a location, it's not just a threat anymore. It becomes evidence of exactly what kind of man he is." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if writing it down isn't enough? What if nobody cares?" "Some people won't," Clara said. "That's true. But Abel Marsh's son is a clerk at the Territorial Land Office, and I've written Abel's testimony, and the Kellermans, and the Hendersons, and yours, and mine, and Ronan's, and when all of it goes in one dossier, not pieces, all of it together, it becomes very difficult to dismiss." She paused. "Victor Harlan has had 6 years of people dealing with him alone. I am trying to be the first person who doesn't let him keep each of us separate." The jar of preserves sat on the table between them, and Lily was in the corner pretending to read and definitely not reading, her eyes moving between the two women with the careful attention of a child who understands more than adults give her credit for. Margaret reached out and put her hand briefly on top of Clara's. Not a dramatic gesture, just a press and then gone. "I'll write it down," she said. "I'll have Lily write it too." "Lock the copies somewhere safe," Clara said. "Not just one place, 2 places." Margaret nodded and stood to go, and then she paused at the kitchen doorway and said, without turning around, "My grandmother used to say that the most dangerous person in any fight is the one nobody expects to still be standing at the end." She turned her head just slightly, not quite looking back. "She would have liked you." Clara didn't have anything to say to that. She just nodded. After they were gone, she sat at the table for a while without writing anything. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear Pete and the other hands finishing the day's work, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening. She thought about Lily Briggs's careful eyes. She thought about Thomas Briggs on the saloon floor. She thought about Phelan Kellerman's face when he described signing the papers, the particular expression of a man recounting a moment of defeat he would not get over, not fully, not ever. Then she picked up the journal and kept writing. The feed delivery that was supposed to arrive on the 14th of November did not arrive. Pete rode to town and came back without it, and without a good explanation, the feed store owner being vague in a way that suggested he had received some version of a conversation he didn't want to describe. Ronan's face went tight when Pete told him, and he started for his horse, and Clara said, "Wait." He turned. "Let me go instead," she said. "You going in angry is what he's trying to produce. Send me. I'll handle it." "It's not your... Ronan." She said his name with a flatness that stopped him. "I have been managing this household for 6 weeks. The feed is part of the household. Let me do my job." He looked at her for a long moment with something complicated in his face. Then he said, "Don't do anything that puts you at risk." "I'm going to talk to a man about hay," Clara said. "I'll be careful." She was back by mid-afternoon with a signed agreement for the delivery, rescheduled, with a written apology from the store owner that she had requested with the kind of polite, specific firmness that made it easier to comply than to refuse, and a second-hand account from Adeline, who had been in the store when she arrived, of what Victor Harlan's man had said to the owner 2 days prior. What he had said was that any business that continued serving Ronan Mercer should expect to find its own supplies becoming unreliable. Clara wrote it down. Adeline's account with Adeline's name, the name of the store owner, the dates of the delivery failure and the rescheduled arrival, the signed agreement which she folded into the back of the journal. She had now, she thought, looking at what she had assembled, something that was starting to look less like a collection of grievances and more like a document, a real one, the kind that, placed in the right hands, had weight. She sealed a copy of the course summary in an envelope that evening and addressed it, via Abel Marsh's instruction, to his son at the Territorial Land Office in Harshest. She didn't tell Ronan she was sending it. She would tell him. Just not yet, not until she knew if it was going to produce anything. She had learned in other situations that the hope of rescue was sometimes harder to carry than no hope at all if the rescue didn't materialize. So she sealed the envelope. And she rode into town the next morning before breakfast and put it in the postal box herself, and she stood there for a moment after letting it go, her hand still near the slot. Then she turned around and walked back to her horse. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of morning that made this country look like a place worth fighting for, which she supposed was the point, which was why men like Thomas Briggs were still here after 3 decades, and why Ronan Mercer hadn't sold, and why she herself was still standing at a postal box in a town that hadn't exactly welcomed her with open arms. She swung up onto the horse and started back toward the ranch. She had not solved anything yet. She knew that. The letter would take 2 weeks to arrive, and longer to produce any response if it produced one at all. Victor Harlan was still operating freely and would continue to. The feed delivery was rescheduled, but the problem behind it was not resolved. The families in the valley were still afraid, and fear that goes on long enough becomes its own kind of fact on the ground, harder to move than any legal obstacle. But the letter was in the mail, and the journal was in her coat pocket, and she was 4 miles from a ranch that was still standing. She told herself that was enough for today. She almost believed it. The response from Abel Marsh's son took 18 days. It arrived not as an official letter with a territorial seal, but as a single handwritten page tucked inside a note from Abel himself, delivered by a writer Abel had sent personally, rather than trusting the postal route. Clara read it at the kitchen table while Ronan was out with the hands, and she read it twice before she set it down. Abel's son. His name was Daniel Marsh, 33 years old, 8 years as a land records clerk in Harshest, had written carefully, in the measured language of a man who understood that letters could be read by people other than their intended recipient. He said that the summary Claire had sent was, in his professional assessment, organized in a manner consistent with the kind of documentation territorial authorities are equipped to act upon. He said that two of the incidents she described regarding interference with property and commerce were, in his reading, potentially actionable under territorial statute. And he said, in the last paragraph, in slightly less careful language, that he had shown the summary to a colleague whose opinion he trusted, and that his colleague had said, "Whoever put this together knows what they're doing." Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote back the same day, asking Daniel Marsh 3 specific questions about what additional documentation would strengthen the case, what the threshold was for territorial marshal involvement, and whether the land records for Victor Harlan's acquisitions over the past 6 years were part of the public record and therefore accessible. She sealed that letter herself and gave it to Abel's writer directly, standing at the gate in the early morning cold. When she turned back to the house, Ronan was on the porch. "Who was that?" he asked. She had been deciding how to handle this moment for 3 days. "Abel Marsh's son works at the Territorial Land Office," she said. "I sent him a summary of what I've been documenting. He responded." She walked up the porch steps. "I should have told you before I sent it. I decided to wait until I knew if it was going to produce anything. That was the wrong call, and I'm sorry for it." Ronan was very still. "You went around me," he said. "I went around the inaction," she said. "Not you." The distinction landed somewhere in his face. She could see him turning it over, deciding whether it held. The silence stretched long enough that a less stubborn person might have filled it with more explanation. Clara waited. "What did he say?" Ronan finally asked. She handed him the letter. He read it once, fast, the way men who have been waiting for any piece of good news read things. Then he read it again, slower. When he looked up, something had shifted in his face. Not hope exactly, because hope was a dangerous thing and he was too careful for that, but something adjacent to it. Something like this might be real. "We need to tell Thomas Briggs," he said. "We need to tell all of them," Clara said, "but carefully. Not all at once. If Victor hears that the families in this valley are talking to territorial authorities, he'll escalate before we have enough assembled to matter." Ronan handed the letter back. "You think he doesn't already know you're collecting things?" "I think he knows I'm a problem he underestimated," Clara said. "I don't think he knows the scope of it yet." She was wrong about that, as it turned out, but she didn't know it yet, and for the next 10 days, the wrongness of it was still quietly assembling itself on the other side of the valley. The Hendersons' barn went up on a Tuesday night in the last week of November. Clara smelled the smoke before she heard anything. A wrong smell for the hour, something chemical underneath the wood that meant it had been helped along. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, and from the upper story she could see the orange light on the horizon, 3 miles north, roughly where the Henderson property sat. She was dressed in 2 minutes. Ronan and the hands were already moving when she got to the yard, horses saddled, Pete's face white and tight in the lantern light. They rode hard, and they got there in time to save the house and the cattle, but the barn was gone, and it had taken most of a year's worth of stored hay with it, and the Hendersons' oldest son had a burn on his forearm from pulling the last 2 horses out. Nora Henderson stood in her yard in a coat thrown over her nightclothes and watched it burn down to the frame, and she did not cry, which Clara found more devastating than if she had. Clara stood beside her and said nothing for a while. There was nothing to say that wasn't going to be insulting in its inadequacy. Finally, Nora said, "Martin wants to sell." Clara kept her eyes on the burning frame. "What do you want?" "I want my barn back," Nora said flatly. "I want my son's arm not to be burned. I want to have gone to sleep tonight and woken up tomorrow without this." She paused. "But Martin's going to sell." "Can you give me 2 weeks?" Clara asked. Nora turned to look at her. Her face in the firelight was exhausted and hollowed out in the way that people look after catastrophe, when the adrenaline is fading and what's underneath it is just ordinary bone-deep fear. "2 weeks won't fix a barn." "No," Clara said. "It won't, but it might fix the reason the barn is gone." She held Nora's gaze. "I know that's not a fair thing to ask. I know you're standing here right now, and 2 weeks feels like a year. I'm asking anyway." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at the ruin of the barn. 2 weeks, she said, "and I can't promise Martin." "I know," Clara said. 2 weeks is enough." She began documenting the fire on the ride back, by lantern light, her handwriting rougher than usual from the movement of the horse and her hands not entirely steady. She noted the time she'd smelled the smoke, the time they'd arrived, the visible accelerant patterns on what remained of the barn's south wall. She was not an expert, but she had eyes and she used them. And the fact that the fire had started in two separate locations simultaneously, which was not how accidental barn fires started. She wrote, "This is not intimidation anymore. This is an act of deliberate destruction intended to force a sale. The escalation is significant. He is no longer content to make life difficult. He is now willing to cause real harm." Then she wrote, "He is afraid of something. Men who have been winning don't escalate like this. Something has changed his calculation." She thought about that on the ride back to the ranch, her lantern swinging with the horse's gait. She didn't have an answer yet, but the question felt important. Oi. The answer came from an unexpected direction 3 days later, in the form of a woman Clara had never spoken to before, who appeared at the ranch gate on a Friday afternoon driving a private buggy, and who asked, with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment multiple times on the way over, to speak with Clara Winslow. Her name was Evelyn Harlan. Clara had known, in an abstract way, that Victor Harlan had a wife. She had simply never allowed herself to think about what that woman might be like, because thinking about it meant thinking about a person, and thinking about a person complicated things. She had kept Evelyn Harlan as a category, his wife, in the same way you kept a weather pattern as a category, rather than a collection of individual raindrops. But the woman who sat across from her at the kitchen table was not a category. She was perhaps 45, fine-featured, with the particular posture of someone who had learned from childhood to take up as little space as possible. She was dressed well. Victor Harlan's money was visible on her in the same way it was visible on him, in the quality of things. But her hands on the table were not still, and Clara noticed it immediately, because her own hands did the same thing when she was trying very hard to keep her voice even. "I don't know how to begin this," Evelyn said. "Anywhere you want," Clara said. "I'll ask questions if I have gaps." Evelyn looked at her for a moment with something that might have been relief. At the straightforwardness, Clara thought, the absence of performance. Then she said, "I need you to understand that I am not here to help you. I want to be clear about that. I am here because of something specific. And outside of that specific thing, I will not." She stopped, started again. "My situation is not simple." "No," Clara said. "I imagine it isn't." Evelyn absorbed that. "You've been collecting documentation about the incidents." "I'm not going to confirm or deny what I've been doing to someone I don't know," Clara said. Not unkindly, but plainly. Something moved across Evelyn's face. Respect, maybe, or the recognition of it. "Fair," she said. Then, 3 years ago, Victor had legal documents prepared that transferred ownership of a parcel of property belonging to a rancher named Aldous Webb. Mr. Webb died without close family, and Victor claimed there was a will naming him the primary beneficiary. She paused. "There was no such will. I was present when the document was prepared. I know who wrote it, and I know whose signature was forged." The kitchen was entirely quiet. "I have been living with that knowledge for 3 years," Evelyn said. Her voice was very controlled, which meant that underneath it, it was not controlled at all. "I have told myself various things, that it was isolated, that it wouldn't happen again, that it was complicated." She looked at her hands on the table. "Then 3 nights ago, a barn burned down." "You heard about the Henderson barn," Clara said. "I heard Victor come home that night," Evelyn said quietly, "and I know what he looks like when he's done something." She met Clara's eyes. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm not asking you to do anything except know what I've just told you. What you do with it is your business." "I need it in writing," Clara said immediately. "What you just told me. Signed." Evelyn flinched. A small movement, but Clara caught it. "If Victor finds out..." "Evelyn." Clara leaned forward slightly. "I understand what you're risking. I do not say that lightly, and I am not going to tell you it isn't significant. But a verbal account from you to me is a story. A signed written account is evidence. Those are 2 different things in a territorial court, and right now evidence is the only thing that will actually stop him." Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Clara began to think she was going to stand up and leave, and she would not have blamed her. The ask was enormous. The risk was real. Then Evelyn reached into the inside of her coat and produced a folded paper. She unfolded it on the table between them. It was already written. Her handwriting, small, precise, educated, covered one side of the page in full. The details of the web document, the forger's name, the date, what she had witnessed, signed at the bottom with her full name, Evelyn Grace Harlan. Clara looked at it and then looked up at Evelyn, and for a moment she didn't speak. "I wrote it last night," Evelyn said. "I didn't know if I'd actually give it to you. I decided in the buggy on the way over." She paused. "I've been deciding things in the last possible moment my whole life. My mother used to say it was a character flaw. I've always thought last-moment decisions get underestimated," Clara said. She picked up the paper carefully, as if it might break. "You knew before you got here that you were going to give this to me." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes, I think I did." Clara made a copy of it in her own handwriting before Evelyn left, recording every detail, and sealed the original with the rest of the documentation she had been assembling. She noted the date and time of the visit and Evelyn's willingness to testify, which Evelyn had offered with the resigned steadiness of someone who had already grieved the easier version of this. At the gate, before she climbed back into the buggy, Evelyn said, "He's going to file a legal claim on this ranch. I don't know exactly when, but he's had documents prepared. I've seen papers. I don't know all the details, but I know it involves a property dispute and something about a prior deed." She paused. "I think he plans to move within the month." Clara's stomach dropped, though she kept her face neutral. "Thank you," she said. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just make it count." She drove away without looking back, and Clara stood at the gate until the buggy was out of sight, and then she turned and walked fast back to the house. Ronan was at the desk in the office when she came in. She shut the door behind her and said, "He's going to make a legal move on the ranch. Soon. Evelyn Harlan just told me." Ronan stood up so quickly his chair scraped back. "What?" She told him everything, quickly and in order, the way she had trained herself to report things. Facts first, implications after. When she finished, his face was a complicated map of anger and something else, something she identified after a moment as the particular expression of a person confronting a threat they had known was coming but had somehow still hoped wouldn't. "The deed is clean," he said. "I have the original deed. The title is clear. I had it checked when He stopped. "When my wife and I bought this land, we had a lawyer look at it. Everything was legitimate." "I know that," Clara said. "That's not the threat. The threat is a forgery." The word landed in the room like something dropped. "He forged a document for the Webb property 3 years ago," Clara said. "Evelyn witnessed it. She's given me a signed account. That means we know he's capable of it, and we know he's done it before. And if Evelyn is right that he has documents already prepared for this property," she stopped herself. "We need to get the original deed somewhere safe. Not here." Ronan crossed the room and opened a cabinet in the corner. He pulled out a locked tin box, the kind used for important papers, and set it on the desk. His hands were not entirely steady, and he was not pretending they were, which she respected. He found the deed. It was there, intact, exactly where it should be. They looked at it together for a moment. "I need to send everything to Daniel Marsh tonight," Clara said. "All of it. Evelyn's account, the fire documentation, the accumulated record of incidents. Not a summary, the whole thing. And I need to include a note about what Evelyn told me regarding the imminent legal filing. If we alert them and nothing happens, if we don't alert them and something happens, we're behind," she said. "I'd rather be wrong and early than right and late." Ronan picked up the deed and held it for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "She actually came here. Evelyn Harlan actually came here and gave you a signed statement." "Yes." He set the deed down. "Why?" Clara thought about Evelyn's hands on the table, the already written paper in her coat, the decision made in the buggy on the way over. Because a barn burned down, Clara said, and she was done telling herself it wouldn't get worse. The legal filing came not within the month, as Evelyn had predicted, but within 11 days. And it came with a ferocity that suggested Victor Harlan had decided that his indirect approach had run its course. The document was filed at the county courthouse on a Monday morning, before Ronan knew anything about it. He found out because Gerald at the general store, whose cautious watchfulness had gradually shifted over the weeks into something closer to actual solidarity, sent his son to the ranch with a message that simply said, "There's a paper at the courthouse with Mercer's name on it. You should know." Ronan went to town. Clara went with him. He had stopped arguing about her being present for things, which she took as a form of trust that neither of them had put into words yet. The document, which the courthouse clerk, a nervous man in his 50s who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with his own role in this, allowed them to read but not take, claimed that Victor Harlan was the rightful heir to a portion of the Mercer Ranch's northern acreage, based on a deed of gift purportedly signed by Catherine Mercer, Ronan's late wife, 14 months before her death. Ronan read it twice and then stood very still with his hands flat on the clerk's counter. "She never signed this," he said. His voice was completely flat. "She never signed anything like this." The clerk said nothing. His eyes moved to the door and back. "I have her handwriting," Ronan said, still in that flat voice. "Letters, notes, 17 years of her handwriting, that signature." He stopped. "Ronan," Clara said quietly beside him. He stopped. He looked at her. "Not here," she said. Just those two words. He looked back at this document for one more moment, and then he straightened up and thanked the clerk, which cost him something visible, and walked out. In the street, he put his hands on the hitching post and stood with his back to her and breathed. Clara stood behind him and waited. Around them, the sounds of the street continued. Horses, voices, the ordinary noise of a town that was pretending not to notice Ronan Mercer at the hitching post. And after a moment, he turned around and his face had gone back to the careful, controlled expression he wore as armor. "She's been gone 18 months, he said. He used her name, her signature. "I know." He sat there and had someone write her name on a piece of paper, and he stopped. His jaw worked once. "I need to not say what I'm thinking right now." "Then don't," Clara said. "Say it later. Right now, I need you to do something hard." He waited. "I need you to go home," she said, "and get every piece of her handwriting you can find. Letters, notes, anything. Because if this goes to a territorial judge, and it will, that's what we've been building toward, we need to show that signature next to her real handwriting. We need to make the forgery obvious." She paused. "Can you do that?" The question was not really about the handwriting. He knew that. He straightened. "Yes," he said. They rode back in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood what the other was carrying without needing to inventory it out loud. That evening, Ronan brought a wooden box to the kitchen table and set it down with a care that told her what was in it before he opened it. Letters, mostly. Notes in a woman's handwriting that was rounded and confident, and nothing at all like the cramped, careful forgery on the legal document. A birthday card. A list of things needed from town. A letter dated 3 weeks before Catherine Mercer had gotten sick, describing a summer evening and some ordinary complaint about the north fence, and ending with an endearment that Clara did not read past because it was not for her. She worked for 2 hours, with Ronan across the table, selecting the clearest examples. She didn't rush him when he stopped to look at something she hadn't asked about. She just waited and then continued. By the end, she had 8 clear samples that any reasonable person could set against the forged signature and see immediately what had been done. She packaged the copies, she would not send the originals, with the rest of the documentation and added a cover letter to Daniel Marsh explaining the legal filing, the forgery, Evelyn Harlan's prior account of the Webb document, and the specific request for territorial marshal involvement given the escalation from intimidation to arson to legal fraud. She also, for the first time, included a letter addressed not to Daniel, but to whoever his superior at the Territorial Land Office was. She wrote it carefully, in her clearest handwriting, keeping it precise and unemotional, because emotion in a document like this was easy to dismiss, and she could not afford to give anyone a reason to look away. She sealed everything and addressed it. Then she wrote a second package, identical, as close as she could make it, and addressed that one to a territorial circuit judge whose name she had gotten from Daniel's second letter, a Judge Harold Fenn in Harshest, whose jurisdiction covered this county and who, Daniel had noted, was not a man with connections to the local power structure. 2 packages, 2 destinations. If Victor Harlan had anyone watching the postal route, and she had to assume he might, getting only one would still leave one in play. She asked Pete to take one and rode to town herself with the other before dawn. Standing at the postal box for the second time, her breath fogging in the December cold, she felt not the cautious half-hope she'd felt the first time, but something steadier. Heavier, in the way that real things are heavier than possibilities. She had done what she could do from here. Whatever happened next was going to happen in a room she couldn't control, decided by people she hadn't met, based on a stack of paper and the testimony of frightened families, and one woman in a buggy who had decided at the last possible moment to hand over the truth. She put the envelope in the slot. She stood there for a moment with her hand still near the opening, feeling the cold of the metal through her glove. Then she heard hoofbeats behind her, fast, wrong for the hour. And she turned. It was Pete. His horse was lathered, and his face was the particular white of someone who has been riding hard with bad news the whole way. "Miss Winslow," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "The Briggs place. There's men there. Mr. Mercer says come now." She was on her horse in 30 seconds, riding hard through the cold dark, and the envelope was in the mailbox, and there was nothing she could do about what was in it now, which was perhaps the only clean thing about the next 4 hours. The men at the Briggs place, 4 of them, she counted as she came up the road, were not doing anything illegal in the narrow, technical sense that the sheriff would have cared about. They were simply there, on the road outside the Briggs fence, and they had been there since before midnight. And Thomas Briggs had not slept, and Margaret had not slept, and Lily had been in her mother's arms in the kitchen since 2 in the morning because the sound of horses outside in the dark was not something an 11-year-old slept through anymore. Ronan was already there when Clara arrived. He and Thomas were at the fence, and the 4 men on the road were watching with the easy patience of people who were being paid to wait and had nowhere else to be. Clara pulled up beside Ronan and looked at the 4 men on the road, and then looked at Ronan and said very quietly, "Did you send for the sheriff?" "Sheriff won't come," Thomas said, before Ronan could answer. His voice had the rough edge of a man who had been awake all night being afraid. "Already tried. Did he say why?" "Said he didn't see anything actionable." Clara looked at the 4 men on the road. Then she reached into her coat and took out the journal, which she carried everywhere now, and she wrote the date and the time and the number of men and their approximate descriptions and the fact that the sheriff had been contacted and declined to respond. One of the men on the road watched her write. He tilted his head slightly like someone trying to read at a distance. She wrote that too. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. "Making sure this exists," Clara said. She stayed until sunrise. They all did. The 4 men rode away at first light, casually, as if they'd simply been out for an early morning ride that had happened to last all night, and in the quiet that followed their departure, Clara could hear Lily Briggs crying in the house. Not the crying of fear, she thought, but the crying of relief, which was its own kind of sound and its own kind of heartbreak. Margaret came to the fence and looked at Clara across the yard and said, "My husband is inside deciding whether we leave." "What are you deciding?" Clara asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Her face was exhausted and cold and entirely clear of pretense. "I'm deciding whether you're right," she said, "about the evidence, about territorial authorities, about whether any of it works." "I don't know if it works," Clara said honestly. "I know it's the only thing that has a chance of working." Margaret looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "I'll keep Thomas here 2 more weeks." She paused. "But Clara, if nothing comes of this—" "I know," Clara said. "I know." She rode back to the ranch in the pale early morning light, her body aching from the cold and the sleepless night, and she thought about the envelope in the postal box, and about Evelyn Harlan's signed statement, and about Catherine Mercer's handwriting in a wooden box on the kitchen table, and she thought about what Evelyn had said at the gate. Make it count. She had no way to know yet whether she had. But somewhere in Harston, in a territorial land office, Daniel Marsh was going to open a very large envelope in the next 2 weeks, and a circuit judge named Harold Fenn was going to open an identical one. And what happened after that was out of her hands now, which was both the most frightening and the most clarifying feeling she had experienced since she'd arrived in Blackstone Crossing with $42 in a suitcase held shut with a belt. She got back to the ranch as the sun fully cleared the ridge. Ronan was at the gate. He had ridden ahead of her, and he was standing there waiting. Not doing anything, just standing there in the cold morning. And when she rode up, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before and couldn't entirely name. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not going to," he said. "No," she said. "Probably not." He almost said something else. She could see it, some word or collection of words that reached the surface and then didn't make it out. He turned and walked back toward the house, and she dismounted and led her horse to the stable, and the morning was cold and quiet and entirely uncertain. She was still there. The ranch was still standing. For now, that was what there was. The Marshalls arrived on a Thursday. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, not the slow, deliberate sound of men riding to be seen, but the purposeful sound of men riding with somewhere to be. And she went to the window and counted 4 riders coming up the main road into Blackstone Crossing, each with a badge catching the thin winter light. And she stood there for a moment with her hand on the window frame and felt something move through her chest that she was careful not to call relief yet, because relief was for after, and this was still very much the middle. She had not told anyone the Marshalls were coming. She hadn't known exactly when or if. Daniel Marsh's last letter had said only that the documentation had been reviewed by Judge Fenn and that the judge had found it sufficient to warrant further investigation and that she should expect contact from territorial authorities within the coming weeks. That had been 9 days ago. She had not slept fully in 9 days, which was not something she had admitted to anyone, including herself until right now, watching 4 men with badges ride into the town she had arrived in 2 months ago with $42 and a broken-latched suitcase. She put on her coat and walked to the gate. Ronan came out of the barn at the sound of the horses and stood beside her, and for a moment they just watched the riders pass without speaking. Pete appeared behind them from somewhere and then had the good sense to stay quiet. "That's 4 Marshalls," Ronan said. "Yes," Clara said. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not accusation, but the particular expression of a man recalibrating how much had been happening without him fully knowing. "When?" he asked. "I sent everything 9 days ago," she said. "Fenn's letter said weeks, possibly. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to—" She stopped, tried again. "I didn't want to make you wait for something that might not come in the time you'd spend waiting." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the second time you've made that call without telling me," he said. "I know." "I'm not angry," he said, which she suspected was not entirely true. "I just want to understand how you think." "I think," Clara said carefully, "that hope is one of the most expensive things a person can spend. And I didn't want you spending it on something I wasn't sure would materialize." She looked at him. "That's a flaw. I know it's a flaw. I've been told before that I manage things alone when I should be letting other people in." He absorbed that. Then he said, "So what happens now?" "Now," Clara said, "they go to the courthouse. They serve Victor Harlan, and then things get harder before they get easier." She paused. "There will be a hearing, maybe a trial. Victor will fight this with every resource he has, and he has considerable resources. And at some point, someone is going to come after the evidence, or after the people who gave it, or after me specifically." She met his eyes. "I want you to know that going in." Ronan looked at the road where the Marshalls had passed. "You think he'll go after you directly." "I think I'm the most visible problem he has right now," Clara said. "Yes." "Then you're not going anywhere alone," he said. "From here on. I don't care how much you argue about it." She opened her mouth. "Clara," he said. Just her name, with a flatness that was not unlike the flatness she used on him when she needed him to stop and listen. She closed her mouth. "Fine," she said. They went inside to wait for whatever came next. "Bad seat." What came next, initially, was a silence that stretched across 3 days and felt like weather about to break. The marshals had gone to the courthouse first, as Clara had expected, and then to the sheriff's office, where the conversation had apparently been tense enough that Gerald, the storekeeper, who shared a wall with the sheriff's office and had the particular gift of thin walls, reported to Adeline that he had heard raised voices for a solid 20 minutes before a door slammed. The sheriff did not come to the Mercer ranch. He did not appear publicly for 2 days, and when he did, he walked differently. The easy swagger that had made him seem untouchable in this town was gone, replaced by something more careful, a man recalculating the ground under his feet. Victor Harlan did not appear publicly at all. Clara found that more alarming than if he'd come riding into town with his chest out. Visible anger she could track. Invisible anger was harder. She was right to be alarmed. On the evening of the second day, Adeline came to the ranch herself, which she had never done before. She came on foot, which meant she hadn't wanted anyone to see her buggy on the road, and she arrived out of breath and red-cheeked from the cold, and she stood in the kitchen and said, "There's talk about you in town. Not just talk. A specific story." Clara set down what she was doing. "What story?" "That you forged things," Adeline said, and her voice was uncomfortable with the words, the discomfort of someone delivering a message they wish they weren't carrying. "That the documents you sent to the territorial authorities, the letters, the testimonies, that you fabricated them. That you've been running a scheme to defraud Victor Harlan of his legitimately purchased property, and that the families who gave statements were coerced by you." She stopped. "And that there's a man, a lawyer from the county seat, who says he can prove it." The kitchen was very quiet. "A lawyer," Clara said. "What's his name?" "Alistair Kahn," Adeline said. "He arrived this morning. He's already been to the courthouse." Clara knew the name. Not personally. She had never met him. But Daniel Marsh had mentioned it in passing in his second letter as the name of the attorney Victor Harlan used for property transactions. She had noted it and not thought about it again because at the time she hadn't known it would matter. She thought about it now. "He's going to attack the documentation," she said, more to herself than Adeline. "He's going to try to make it about me rather than about Victor. If he can convince the marshals that the evidence was assembled by someone with a personal agenda or fraudulent intent, everything gets questioned." She paused. "How many people in town have heard the story so far?" "Enough," Adeline said. Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know that wasn't easy." Adeline looked at her with the expression of someone who had something else to say and was deciding whether to say it. Then she said, "There are people in this town who want you to be wrong, not because they like Victor, because if you're right, it means they should have done something a long time ago and didn't, and that's a hard thing to sit with." She paused. "I'm not one of them, but I want you to know they exist because they'll be in that courtroom." After Adeline left, Clara sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time. Ronan was out with the hands. The house was quiet. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them and went through everything methodically. Not with panic, because panic was not useful, but with the focused, almost clinical attention she had learned to apply to situations that were threatening to get away from her. Alistair Kahn's argument would hinge on her credibility. That was the line of attack, and it was not a stupid one. She was a woman of no particular social standing, relatively new to Blackstone Crossing, with no professional credentials, who had arrived at a contested ranch and proceeded to assemble a legal case against the most powerful man in the county. The story of her as an opportunist or a fraud was not a hard story to tell to people who wanted to believe it. What could not be questioned, if presented clearly, was the documentation itself. Not her account of events, but the accounts of other people, documented in their own words, signed by their own hands. Evelyn Harlan's statement. Margaret Briggs's account of what happened to Lily. Phelan Kellerman's testimony about the pressure that preceded his sale. Abel Marsh's account of 6 years of witnessed behavior. The signed fee delivery agreement with its implicit acknowledgement of interference. The fire. The forged deed. None of those things were her fabrications. She had collected them, yes, but they existed independent of her. She picked up the journal and held it for a moment. The journal was hers, her observations, her analysis, her handwriting throughout. It was also, potentially, the thing Alistair Kahn would focus on. You wrote all of this yourself. Who can verify any of it? She had anticipated something like this, in a general way, which was why she had kept the other accounts separate from the beginning, why she had asked for signatures, why she had sent originals to Harston and kept copies, why she had... She reached into the back of the journal and counted. 4 independent witnesses who had been present for documented incidents who could be called to testify to what they personally observed. The journal was not the case. The journal was the index to the case. She wrote that down. Then she wrote out, over the next 2 hours, a precise summary of the evidentiary structure of what she had assembled, what could be questioned and what couldn't, and what the counterargument to each likely challenge was. Not for anyone else, just to have it clear in her own head. When Ronan came in and found her still at the table, he looked at the pages spread out in front of her and said, "How bad?" "Victor has an attorney working to discredit me personally," she said. "It's manageable, but I need to talk to all the witnesses before the hearing and make sure they know what's coming." He sat down. "When's the hearing?" "I don't know yet. Soon, based on how fast Khan got here." She looked up. "Ronan, they're going to come after your credibility too. You should know that. You have the most direct interest in the outcome, which they'll use to argue bias." "I know," he said. "You need to be very controlled in that room. Every time you get angry..." "I know, Clara." His voice was tight. "I'm not questioning your ability to control yourself," she said. "I'm telling you that he is going to try to provoke you, specifically, because an angry rancher who lost his wife and now stands to lose his land is a much easier story to dismiss than a calm man with a documented case." She paused. "He's going to mention Catherine." Ronan's jaw tightened. "I know," he said again, quieter. "If he does," she said, "you look at the judge and not at Victor. You don't look at Victor at all in that room if you can avoid it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know all of this?" "This isn't housekeeping." Clara looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It isn't." He waited. "I told you my husband made things difficult when he wanted to," she said. "He had a lawyer too. I sat in a room and had my credibility taken apart piece by piece, and I didn't know it was coming, and I didn't know how to answer it." She kept her voice even. "I know now. That's how I know." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing against the house in the way the wind did in December out here, reminding you it was there. "We should tell Thomas and Margaret tonight," Ronan said. "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. "Tonight I need to finish this." He stood, and she expected him to go to bed, but instead he refilled the coffee and set a cup in front of her and sat back down across the table. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, and she understood that he was staying, and she did not tell him it was unnecessary, because it wasn't. The hearing was set for the 14th of December, 11 days away. Clara spent those 11 days in a kind of focused urgency that she later struggled to describe, not frantic, because frantic made mistakes, but densely concentrated, the way a fire concentrates when it runs out of space to spread. She visited every person who had given a statement and prepared each of them for what cross-examination would feel like. She was honest about it, which meant some conversations were uncomfortable. With Phelan Kellerman, who had been drinking steadily since she'd first spoken to him, and whose memory for detail was starting to fray at the edges, she spent 3 hours going through his account line by line, not changing it. She would not change it, but making sure that what he said in the courtroom matched what he had signed, because any discrepancy, however innocent, would be used. Phelan sat across from her in his borrowed kitchen and ran his hands over his face and said, "I'm not good at talking in front of people. Never have been." "You don't have to be good at it," Clara said. "You just have to say what you know. Alistair Kahn is going to try to confuse you. He'll ask the same question different ways. He'll imply that you're misremembering. He'll suggest that the pressure you experienced was normal business practice and that you interpreted it incorrectly." She paused. "When that happens, you come back to what you know, what you saw, what you heard, not what you interpreted, not what you thought it meant, what you personally experienced. Can you do that?" Phelan looked at his hands. "Dorothea thinks I shouldn't testify," he said. "She thinks it'll just make things worse for us." "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said slowly, That I signed those papers and I've been ashamed of it since. And if I don't say what I know, then that shame doesn't go anywhere. It just stays." He looked up. "Dorothy is not wrong that it might make things harder. She's also not wrong about a lot of other things. But this one," he stopped. "I was a coward once. I'd rather not be a coward twice." Clara nodded. "Then just tell the truth," she said, "exactly as you remember it." With Margaret Briggs, the preparation was different. Margaret was not going to fall apart under questioning. Clara was certain of that. But she was going to get angry, which was its own problem. Margaret's anger was quiet and dense and entirely justified. And an entirely justified anger was sometimes the most dangerous kind in a courtroom because it made you want to argue rather than simply state. "When he asks about Lily," Clara said, "just describe what happened. Don't characterize it. Don't say it was wrong or threatening or deliberate. Just say, 'My daughter is 11 years old. She was outside the schoolhouse. A man approached her and asked these specific questions. Let the judge hear it and decide what it is.'" "He'll make it sound innocent," Margaret said. "He'll try. And then the judge will look at an 11-year-old girl being approached by one of Victor Harlan's known associates outside her school and decide for himself whether it was innocent." Margaret pressed her lips together. "Lily wants to testify." Clara looked at her carefully. "What do you want?" "I want her to never have to know that any of this happened," Margaret said. "But that ship has sailed." She paused. "She's clear-headed, clearer than Thomas right now, honestly. She remembers exactly what he said. A child's testimony," Clara said, "clearly given, honestly remembered, is very difficult to shake. If Lily wants to testify and you're comfortable with it, it could matter." She met Margaret's eyes. "But only if she's doing it because she wants to, not because she feels like she should." "She told me," Margaret said, "that she wants the man to get in trouble." "That's what she said?" "I want the man to get in trouble." Clara thought about Lily's watchful eyes at the kitchen table the first day she'd met them. "Then let her." Evelyn Harlan was the conversation Clara approached most carefully. She rode to the edge of the Harlan property. She would not go further, she had made that calculation, and sent word through Abel Marsh that she needed to speak with Evelyn before the hearing. 3 days before the 14th, Evelyn came to the ranch again, and this time she looked different. Not more composed, possibly less, actually. The careful performance of the first visit was gone, replaced by something raw. "He knows I came here," Evelyn said, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. "He hasn't said so directly, but he knows." "Are you safe?" Clara asked. Directly, not delicately. Evelyn looked at her. He's never..." She stopped. Tried again. "Victor does not use his hands," she said carefully. "That's not how he operates." "There are other ways to be unsafe," Clara said. "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I've been unsafe in the other ways for a long time." She set the cup down. "I'm going to testify. I've already told the marshal who came to take my statement. I don't want you to think I'm going to retreat at the last moment." "I didn't think that," Clara said. "You weren't sure," Evelyn said, not unkindly. "That's fair. I wasn't sure either until recently." She looked out the kitchen window. "When I testified to the marshal, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I don't have a name for it. Something like..." She shook her head. "Like I existed. Like I was a person whose account of events was worth writing down." She paused. "That sounds pathetic." "It doesn't," Clara said. "Victor is going to have Khan destroy me in court," Evelyn said. "I'm his wife. The obvious argument is that I'm a scorned woman making things up for reasons of my own. I want to know how to answer that." "Tell the truth," Clara said. "Exactly as it happened. Exactly as you documented it. If the argument is that you're lying for personal reasons, the answer is to be so specific and so consistent that there's no room for the lie to fit." She paused. "And you're not the only witness. You're one piece of a documented pattern. Khan can attack you, but he can't attack you and Phelan Kellerman and Margaret Briggs and Abel Marsh and Thomas Briggs and Nora Henderson simultaneously without it starting to look like what it is, a man trying to discredit everyone who saw what he did." Evelyn nodded slowly. Then she said, "Clara, What happens to me after? Whatever happens in that courtroom. What happens to me after? Clara looked at her honestly. I don't know, she said. I wish I had a better answer. Evelyn picked up the coffee cup and drank from it this time. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years, she said. I'll take it. The hearing fell on a cold, clear morning with a sky the color of pale iron and frost on every surface. Clara had not slept. She was wearing the best dress she owned, which was not very impressive by any standard but was clean and pressed, and she had her journal in a satchel along with the organized documentation, each section labeled in her careful hand, each piece cross-referenced to the witness or incident it supported. The courthouse was the largest building in Blackstone Crossing by a small margin. By the time Clara and Ronan arrived, there were people standing outside who couldn't fit inside. More people than she had seen gathered in this town since she arrived. People who had not spoken to her, who had looked away when she passed them on the main street, who had repeated Victor Harlan's rumors as if they were weather reports. They were standing outside the courthouse on a cold morning in December, and she couldn't tell yet what it meant that they were there. Thomas Briggs found her at the door. He was clean-shaved in a way that looked like it had cost him something, wearing his good coat, and he shook her hand without saying anything, which told her that whatever he'd been feeling these past weeks, the shame, the fear, the fury, had condensed into this morning and into the handshake. She found her seat at the table designated for the parties filing the complaint, with the marshal who had taken the lead on the investigation, a solid, quiet man named Hargrove who had the specific competence of someone who had been doing his job a long time without needing anyone to notice. Beside her, Ronan sat behind her with the Briggses and the Hendersons and Abel Marsh, who moved slowly but sat straight. Victor Harlan came in with Alistair Kahn and two other men Clara didn't recognize, and he looked, she thought, almost exactly as he always looked. Composed, unhurried, possessed of the specific calm of a man who has not yet fully accepted that this situation is different from every other one. He glanced at the room, and his gaze moved across Clara without landing, which was deliberate, which meant he was more rattled than he looked. Kahn was everything Daniel Marsh's oblique references had suggested. Polished, quick-eyed, with the manner of a man who had won a great many arguments in rooms like this one. He reviewed his papers with the easy confidence of someone who has come to an event he expects to control. Judge Harold Fenn arrived and the room went quiet. He was 60, perhaps 65, gray-haired and angular, and he had the quality that certain people in certain positions acquire after long enough. Not impressiveness exactly, but density, the sense of a person who had been tested enough times to know what he was made of. He looked at the room and then at his papers, and then called the proceeding to order in a voice that was not loud, but that nobody in the room would have considered not listening to. Kahn opened first, which Clara had expected. His argument was precisely what she had prepared for, organized, persuasive, and aimed directly at her. He did not deny everything, which would have been too obvious. He acknowledged that there had been disputes between neighboring ranchers in Blackstone Crossing, acknowledged that the acquisition of land in the valley over the preceding years had created tensions. What he disputed was the characterization of those disputes as coordinated criminal conduct, and what he attacked, systematically, with the precision of someone who had been preparing this for days, was the documentation. He questioned whether witnesses had been coached. He raised the possibility that accounts had been coordinated to support a predetermined conclusion. He described the journal as a single individual's subjective record of events, unverifiable and self-serving. And then, as Clara had known he would, he came to her. He described her arrival in Blackstone Crossing with what he called undisclosed prior circumstances. He suggested, without quite saying so, that a woman who had left one situation under unclear conditions might have motives for her current conduct that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with personal advancement. He said the word opportunist once, quickly, then moved past it as if he hadn't said it at all. Clara sat with her hands flat on the table and did not look at Ronan and did not look at Victor Harlan and breathed. Hargrove, to his credit, presented the documentation with the methodical clarity of someone who had been doing this long enough not to be ruffled by Kahn's performance. He walked through the incidents in chronological order. He presented the signed statements. He submitted the samples of Catherine Mercer's handwriting alongside the forged deed, and he asked Judge Fenn to compare them, which the judge did in a silence that lasted nearly a full minute. When Fenn looked up from the handwriting comparison, something had changed in his face. It was not a dramatic change. It was the small, precise shift of a man who has just been confirmed in something he suspected. Phelan Kellerman testified and was visibly nervous and said what he knew and did not add to it or diminish it. And when Kahn tried to suggest that he had misinterpreted normal business pressure, Phelan said flatly, "A man sitting on the road outside my house for 3 weeks while my feed deliveries stop and my bank starts asking questions isn't normal business practice where I come from." And then he didn't say anything else, which was exactly right. Margaret Briggs was precise and cold and completely unshakable. And when Kahn asked whether she might be exaggerating the incident involving her daughter, she turned and looked at him with the particular expression of a mother being asked whether she might have misread a threat to her child. And she said, in a voice so controlled it was somehow more devastating than anger would have been, "My daughter is 11 years old." She remembered every word the man said because she was frightened enough that she went home and wrote it down herself. "I brought what she wrote. You can read her handwriting if you'd like." Kahn did not ask to see it. Clara was called in the afternoon. She had known this was coming, and she had told herself she was prepared for it, and she discovered, sitting in the witness seat with the room full of faces, some she knew, some she didn't, all of them watching, that prepared and ready were not quite the same thing. Her hands were not entirely still. She put them in her lap where they couldn't be seen. Hargrove walked her through the documentation chronologically, and she answered each question clearly and specifically and without embellishment, because embellishment was exactly what Kahn was waiting for. She described what she had observed, what she had been told, and by whom, and what she had concluded, and she was careful to distinguish between each category. Then Kahn stood up. He started with her background, as she had expected. He asked about her reasons for leaving Denver. He asked about the dissolution of her marriage, phrasing it with a careful ambiguity designed to imply wrongdoing without alleging it. He asked whether she had had prior disputes with employers. He asked, with the particular smile of someone setting a trap, whether she would describe herself as someone who had a personal interest in seeing Ronan Mercer's land protected. "Yes," she said. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. "I work for him," she said. "His financial stability is directly connected to my employment. That's a matter of public record, and I would not pretend otherwise." She kept her voice even. "If you're asking whether my interest in the case is personal, the answer is yes. I also believe the documentation speaks for itself, which is why I made sure that each piece of it was independently verifiable, signed by the person who observed the incident, witnessed where possible, and cross-referenced to available records." She paused. "If you'd like to question the documentation specifically, I'm glad to answer questions about any individual item." Kahn shifted his approach. He went for the journal, exactly as she'd known he would, suggesting that a single person's handwritten notes were not evidence of anything except that person's opinions. "The journal is an index," Clara said. "It references each documented incident by date and directs to the corresponding signed statement. The journal itself is not the evidence. It is the organizational structure of the evidence." She reached into the satchel and produced the cross-reference document she had prepared, which she had asked Hargrove to submit as an exhibit. "Every entry in the journal corresponds to a signed document or a verifiable record. I've provided a full cross-reference. If there's a specific entry you believe has no corroborating document, I'd like to know which one." Kahn looked at the cross-reference. He looked at it for a moment longer than he intended to, which told her that he was recalculating, and the recalculation was not going his way. He tried once more. He said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has been waiting for the right moment, "Miss Winslow, isn't it true that you encouraged witnesses to characterize normal business disputes as criminal conduct, and that without your influence, these individuals would never have come forward with these complaints?" Clara looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Phelan Kellerman lost 22 years of his family's land," she said. "Thomas Briggs was pulled across a saloon floor in front of his wife and child. The Henderson family's barn was burned with accelerant applied at 2 separate points simultaneously. Lily Briggs is 11 years old and she stopped sleeping through the night after a grown man approached her outside her school to ask when her family was leaving town. She paused. I didn't create those experiences. I asked people to write them down. The room was very quiet. I have no further questions, Con said. Evelyn Harlan was the last witness called, and her testimony was the thing that ended it. Not in the dramatic, sudden way of stories, but in the quiet, irrevocable way of certain truths. She described the web document in precise detail. She described the forger's name, a man who had since left the county, but whose identity Daniel Marsh had been able to cross-reference against land office records, confirming a known association with Con's firm. She described the date and the circumstances with the specificity of a woman who had been carrying the memory of it for 3 years and had never once allowed herself to forget a single detail, because she had known, somewhere underneath everything, that someday she might need it. Con's cross-examination of Evelyn was brief and visibly uncomfortable, because there was no version of attacking a woman's credibility about her own husband that did not carry its own weight in the room. He tried twice, gently, and Evelyn answered both times with the quiet, absolute steadiness of a person who has already lost the thing she was afraid of losing and is therefore no longer afraid. Judge Fenn called a recess and came back 40 minutes later. He found Victor Harlan's legal claim on the Mercer property fraudulent in its foundation and ordered it dismissed. He referred the evidence of the forged Catherine Mercer document to the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. He noted, in language that Clara would read 4 times later in the court transcript, that the documentation submitted by the complainants demonstrated a coordinated pattern of intimidation and fraud that is consistent across multiple independent witnesses and represents a deliberate and sustained campaign against the property rights and personal safety of numerous individuals in this county. He ordered Victor Harlan held pending formal charges. The room did not erupt. It wasn't like that. There was a sound, not quite a noise, more like a collective exhale, the release of something that had been held too long. And then people were talking in low voices, and somewhere behind her, Clara heard Thomas Briggs say something she couldn't make out, and then go quiet. She sat at the table and did not move for a moment. Hargrove sat down beside her and said quietly, "Good work." She nodded. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed as a distant fact, the way you notice the weather from inside. Ronan came through the low gate from the gallery behind her, and he didn't say anything either. He just sat in the chair next to her, and they sat there together while the room slowly cleared around them. And outside the courthouse windows, the pale iron sky had gone the color of late afternoon, and somewhere in the building, Victor Harlan was being processed for formal charges, and the sheriff was visible through the window standing on the courthouse steps, looking like a man deciding very quickly which way the wind had shifted and how to reorient accordingly. Clara looked at her hands and waited for them to stop shaking. "You okay?" Ronan asked, low. "I will be," she said, which was not the same as yes, but was the truest answer she had. Abel Marsh found her on the courthouse steps when she finally went outside. He was moving slowly, leaning on a cane she hadn't seen him use before, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment with his old, tired, clear eyes. "My grandmother," he said, "used to say that the only real power is the one that holds up when someone pushes back." Clara looked at him. "Yours held up," he said simply. Then he moved past her down the steps, slowly and with considerable dignity. She stood there on the courthouse steps in the December cold and watched the town of Blackstone Crossing move around her, and for the first time since she had arrived with $42 and a letter of reference from a schoolmaster who had called her stubbornly capable, she did not feel like someone fighting to stay on her feet. She just stood there, present, still. It was, she thought, an unfamiliar feeling. She decided she didn't mind it. The days after the hearing did not feel like victory. Clara had expected that, in some distant, rational part of herself. She had seen enough of how hard things ended to know that the ending was rarely clean. But she had not quite prepared for the specific texture of the aftermath, the way the town of Blackstone Crossing seemed to hold its breath for a full week after Victor Harlan was escorted out of his own courthouse, as if no one entirely believed yet that the man who had defined the terms of this valley for 6 years was actually gone from the equation, or at least removed enough from it that the old rules no longer applied. People did not rush to celebrate. They were cautious in the way that people are cautious after a long illness, not quite trusting the absence of pain, half expecting it to return. Clara understood that too. She spent the first 3 days after the hearing in a kind of suspended stillness that she recognized as her body's response to the end of sustained high alert. She slept, which she had not done properly in weeks. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not write anything, which felt strange after months of constant documentation. She walked the ranch in the early mornings and looked at the land that was still Ronan's land, still standing, still exactly where it had been, and tried to let that fact settle into something that felt real rather than provisional. Ronan gave her those 3 days without comment, which was one of the more generous things anyone had done for her in recent memory, even if he probably didn't know that's what he was doing. On the 4th day, she went back to work. The formal criminal proceedings against Victor Harlan were conducted in Hardened before a different judge in a larger courthouse, and they stretched across the better part of 2 months. Clara was called to testify twice. Both times she made the 2-day ride with Ronan, and both times she sat in the witness seat and answered questions with the same careful, specific precision she had used in Blackstone Crossing. And both times Alistair Khan, who had managed to retain his position despite the obvious complications of his firm's documented connection to the forger, attempted variations on the same attack he'd used the first time. It worked less well the second time, partially because Fenn's ruling had already established the evidentiary record as credible, partially because the witnesses who came to Harston, Phelan Kellerman, Thomas Briggs, Abel Marsh, Nora Henderson, and Evelyn, had testified once already and were harder to shake the second time through. But mostly, Clara thought, because the truth had a certain quality of structural integrity when it was consistently and specifically told. It didn't shift. You could push against it, and it held its shape. Lies, eventually, developed inconsistencies, small places where the mortar between the pieces was not quite right, and this case had had 6 years to accumulate them. The forger was located in a town 2 counties over, working under a different name. He cooperated with investigators almost immediately, which Clara had not expected, and which Ronan said, when she told him, suggested the man had been carrying the weight of it longer than he'd let on. His cooperation confirmed Evelyn's account in every particular. It also confirmed that the pressure campaign against the ranchers in Blackstone Crossing had been deliberate, coordinated, and directly ordered. Nothing had been the initiative of overeager associates. Nothing had been misunderstood. Victor Harlan had designed each step himself and monitored its progress. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on 7 counts: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud, 3 counts of orchestrating willful destruction of property, including the Henderson barn, and 1 count related to the intimidation of a minor, which was Lily Briggs. The sentencing was handled without drama. A territorial judge reading numbers into a record in a room that smelled of old wood and cold. And Clara sat in the gallery and listened and felt, not triumph, but something quieter. A settling. The way a building settles when its foundation is finally right. Ronan was beside her. He sat through the sentencing without moving, and when it was done and people were standing and gathering their coats, he just sat for another moment, looking at nothing in particular, and she let him. Then he said, "Is it over?" "The legal part," she said. "What's the other part?" She thought about it honestly. "The part where everyone figures out who they are now that he's not in the room," she said. "That takes longer." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he stood up, and they walked out of the Harston courthouse into a January afternoon that was cold and bright, and the ride home took 2 days, and they talked about practical things. The ranch, the spring planting schedule, whether Pete was finally ready to take on more responsibility with the cattle accounting, and occasionally they didn't talk at all, which had become, somewhere over the preceding months, a comfortable thing between them. The question of Evelyn Harlan was not resolved by the verdict, and Clara had always known it wouldn't be. She went to see Evelyn 2 weeks after the sentencing, alone, riding to the Harlan property, which was now the subject of several competing legal claims from the families Victor had defrauded, a process that would take its own months to untangle. and finding Evelyn in the main house, which was large and well-furnished and very quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the person who determined the atmosphere is no longer in them. Evelyn was sitting at a writing desk when Clara was shown in, and she looked up with the expression of someone who had been expecting a variety of visitors over the past weeks and was mildly surprised that this one had taken this long. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Evelyn said. "I should have come sooner," Clara said, sitting down across from her. "I'm sorry." Evelyn waved it away. "You were occupied." She looked at Clara steadily. "What did you want to ask?" "I didn't come to ask anything," Clara said. "I came to see how you were." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, as if this were a type of visit she needed to recategorize. Then she said, "I don't entirely know how to answer that." She turned slightly in her chair, looking out the window at the Harlan land, the land that was no longer in any meaningful sense hers either. "I've had people come to ask what I'm going to do, the lawyers, Victor's business associates who are now managing their own exposure, my sister who lives in Omaha and wants me to come and stay." She paused. "Nobody has come to ask how I am." "How are you?" Clara asked again. Evelyn looked at her hands on the writing desk. "Frightened," she said. "But it's a different kind of frightened than before. Before, I was frightened of what would happen if something changed. Now I'm frightened of all the things I'm going to have to decide without already knowing the answer." She glanced up. "That's probably progress, but it doesn't feel like progress yet." "It usually doesn't," Clara said. Evelyn nodded. Then she said, "The families who are filing claims on the acquired properties, the Kellermans, the others, do you think they'll get them back?" "Some of them might," Clara said honestly. "The legal process will be complicated and slow, and not everything will be recoverable. But some of it will. The Kellermans' land specifically, the original sale agreement is already being reviewed, given that the forger's cooperation has invalidated several of the related contracts." She paused. "It won't undo the years, but they'll have the land." Evelyn absorbed this. "That matters," she said quietly. "That it was worth what I did. That matters to me." "It was," Clara said. They sat for a moment in the quiet of that large, well-furnished room that had belonged to a man who would not be coming back to it. "I'm going to Omaha," Evelyn said. "My sister's offer is genuine, and I have a niece I've seen perhaps 4 times in her life because Victor found family visits inconvenient." She said this flatly, without drama, the way you state a fact that has already been fully processed. "I don't know what comes after that. I've spent 22 years arranging my life around someone else's preferences. I don't have a strong sense of what my own preferences are, which is a strange thing to realize at 45. "You'll figure it out," Clara said. "Not quickly, probably. But you will." Evelyn looked at her. "How did you figure out yours?" "After your husband." Clara thought about it. "Badly," she said. "And slowly. And not in the right order." She paused. "But I did." Something in Evelyn's face relaxed very slightly. It was not a smile. It was the thing that comes before a smile, when you've heard something true and your face acknowledges it before the rest of you catches up. "That's almost comforting," she said. "Almost is usually the best I can do," Clara said, and this time Evelyn did smile briefly, and it changed her face entirely. Clara rode back to the Mercer ranch in the late afternoon light, and she thought about the things you can and cannot give people. How you can document the truth and organize the evidence and build a structure of facts strong enough to survive a territorial court, but you cannot give a person back the years they spent afraid, and you cannot give Phelan Kellerman back the particular dignity he'd had before he'd signed those papers, and you cannot give Thomas Briggs back whatever he lost on that saloon floor with his daughter watching. Some things are simply gone, and the best you can say about it is that the person who took them is no longer in a position to take anything else. She was still thinking about that when she got back and found Ronan sitting on the porch steps in the cold with his coat on, and an expression she had come to read as meaning he had been waiting for her but would not have said so. "How is she?" he asked. "Frightened in a different direction," Clara said. "She'll manage." He nodded. He moved slightly on the step, making space, which was an invitation, and she sat beside him, which was an acceptance. They sat in the late afternoon cold and looked at the ranch, and Clara thought about the first time she had stood at this gate with her suitcase and her $42 and her letter of reference, and how the place had looked tired then. It still looked tired, in the way that working land always looks. There is no version of a ranch that looks rested. It wears its use on its surface like the lines on a working person's hands. But it looked different to her now. It looked like somewhere that had been fought for, which gave it a quality that couldn't be built in, only earned. "I need to ask you something," Ronan said. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the land, not at her. This was, she had learned, how he handled things that cost him something to say. He said them to the middle distance while he was still getting them organized. When this is all settled, the legal proceedings, the land claims, all of it, what are you planning to do? She was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you came here for a job," he said. "A housekeeper position, and what you've done here is not what I put in that advertisement." He paused. "I don't know what you want. I've never asked." It was true, he hadn't. She had offered information about herself voluntarily, and he had absorbed it and worked with it, but he had never asked, "What do you want?" It was a simple question that nobody had put to her directly in longer than she could immediately calculate. "I don't know exactly," she said honestly. "Fair," he said. "I know some things," she said. "I know I don't want to leave." She said it before she'd fully decided to, which was unusual for her, and she heard it hanging there in the cold air and didn't take it back. "I know the accounting here needs someone consistently, not occasionally. I know Pete is good with animals and bad with numbers, and that's not going to change, and the feed contract comes up in April, and the north fence is going to need significant repair before spring, or you'll spend May chasing cattle off the Briggs property." He turned his head and looked at her. "I know those things," she said, "about what I want more broadly." She stopped. "I think I'm still working on that part." He looked at her for a long moment. The light was going now, the sky going that deep winter blue that happened fast out here. "Clara," he said, and then stopped and she waited, and he said, "I'm not good at this. Saying things. Catherine used to." He stopped again. Tried again. "She used to say I communicated primarily through action, and she had learned to read it, but it had taken her 3 years and a lot of patience." "What action are you trying to communicate right now?" Clara asked. He looked at her steadily. "That I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper. That's what I'm trying to communicate." The word "not" landed between them and settled. Clara thought about her first night in this house, when she had stood in the doorway of his office and looked at the accounting books and felt, without any rational basis for it, that she was supposed to be here. She had called it dangerous then. She had been right that it was dangerous, just wrong about what kind. "You're going to have to be clearer than that," she said. "I've been managed by implication before and it didn't go well for anyone." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man who has been caught out by fair play. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as an employee. Here, with me." He held her gaze. "That's as clear as I know how to be right now." Clara looked at him for a moment, at the face she had been reading for months, tired, careful, controlled, and underneath all of that, something stubborn and genuine that had refused to leave even when leaving would have been the easier thing. "Yes," she said. "But I want the accounting consolidated properly first, because if we're going to do this, I'm not managing 2 separate sets of records." He stared at her. "The household accounts and the ranch accounts have been kept separately, and it creates redundancy," she said. "I've been meaning to bring it up." "That's your condition," he said. "It's not a condition," she said. "It's an observation about practical efficiency. My answer is yes regardless. I just want you to know about the records." He shook his head slowly, and the thing that had been adjacent to a smile became an actual one. Briefly, the kind that changed the whole geography of his face. It was the first time she had seen it without reservation, without tiredness behind it or caution around it, just the smile itself. "All right," he said. "The records." "And the north fence," she said. "Clara." "I know," she said. "Yes." I know. They married in March, when the worst of the winter had lifted, but before the mud of the real thaw made everything difficult. It was not an elaborate occasion. Neither of them was the kind of person who needed an elaborate occasion. And the practical reality was that there was fence repair still pending, and the feed contract negotiation had taken 3 sessions and was not yet fully resolved. They went to the Justice of the Peace in Blackstone Crossing on a Thursday morning with Thomas and Margaret Briggs as witnesses, and Pete standing in the back in his good shirt with his hat in both hands, and an expression of such earnest emotion that Clara had to look away from him to keep her own composure. The Justice of the Peace was a small, efficient man who had clearly conducted this particular ceremony enough times that he had stripped it down to its essential structure, which suited both of them fine. He read the words. Ronan said what he was supposed to say, and Clara said what she was supposed to say, and they looked at each other while they said it, and Clara thought about the woman who had stood at a postal box in the dark in December and put an envelope through the slot and told herself that was enough for today. It had been enough. And then more had come, as it sometimes did when you did the next right thing and the next right thing after that, without waiting for the guarantee that it would work. After, in the small anteroom of the justice's office, while Margaret fussed with something on Ronan's collar, and Thomas shook his hand with the particular grip of a man expressing things he didn't have the words for, Clara stood slightly apart and held for a moment the full weight of where she was. Not triumphantly, not with the clean satisfaction of a story wrapping up. She held it the way you hold complicated things, acknowledging all the parts, including the ones that were still unresolved, and the ones that had cost more than she'd expected, and the ones she was still figuring out. Then Pete appeared at her elbow with his hat still in his hands and said, with absolute sincerity, Miss Mrs. Mercer, I just want to say that you are the most... He stopped, started again. I think this ranch is going to be okay now. Clara looked at him. He was 23 years old, and earnest to a degree that should have been irritating but wasn't, because underneath the earnestness was something real. Pete, she said, it was going to be okay anyway. You just couldn't see it yet. He blinked at her. You think so? I think Ronan Mercer was not going to let this land go, she said. That was true before I got here. I helped, but the core of it was already there. Pete thought about this. You're not going to take any credit, are you? I'll take the accounting, she said. That's legitimately mine. He laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him. And then Ronan was beside her and Pete excused himself, suddenly remembering he'd left something outside, which he almost certainly hadn't. Ronan looked at her. What did you say to him? I told him the truth, she said. Which truth? That you were going to hold on regardless. She met his eyes. That was always true. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the narrow window of the anteroom, Blackstone Crossing went about its March morning. Horses on the main street, voices, the ordinary noise of a town that was finding its way back to something resembling normal, which was a slow process with setbacks, as all real processes were. I'm not sure I would have, he said. Held on. If you hadn't... You would have, she said. I know because of how you looked at this land the day I arrived. You don't look at something that way and let it go. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no more trouble reading now than she'd had on the first day, which was to say she still couldn't entirely name it, but she had stopped needing to. Come home, he said. They went home. The Kellermans got their land back in April. It took a territorial court order and 4 months of legal proceedings, and the house had been poorly maintained during the interval, and there was a section of the east field that would need replanting from scratch. Phelan stood at the gate of his own property for a long time before he went through it, and Dorothea was crying, and their daughter was walking ahead of them through the high grass with her arms out at her sides, touching the tops of the weeds. Clara heard about it from Margaret, who had been there. She wrote it in the journal, the last entry, the final page, and then she closed it. She had kept 2 journals in the end. The first was the evidentiary record, which had been formally submitted to the territorial court and was now part of the public proceedings, available to anyone who cared to review it, which meant that Victor Harlan's methods were documented in a permanent record that could not be quietly revised or forgotten. That one was no longer hers to keep. The second journal, the one she had carried in her coat through cold mornings and sleepless nights, and a December day at a postal box, was hers. She kept it. The Henderson barn was rebuilt in a single weekend in late April. It was not an organized event exactly. There was no formal announcement. Thomas Briggs showed up at the Henderson property on a Saturday morning with lumber he'd been quietly collecting for 2 months. And Abel Marsh came with 2 of his workers, and Ronan brought Pete and the other hands, and Gerald from the general store appeared at noon with his teenage son and a look that suggested he had been wanting to do something useful for a while and was relieved to finally have the specific occasion. Nora Henderson stood in her yard and watched them work, and by afternoon there were 12 people building a barn that one man had burned down, and the afternoon had the quality of things that happen when people stop waiting for someone to make it possible and just do the thing. Clara brought food and worked alongside Margaret at the long table set up in the yard, and at some point in the late afternoon when the frame was up and the work was loud and physical around them, Margaret said, without looking up from what she was doing, "You know what the strangest thing is?" "What?" Clara said. "I was afraid of this valley for 4 months," Margaret said. "Genuinely afraid. I lay awake at night afraid. And now I'm standing in the Hendersons' yard watching my husband and your husband and old Abel Marsh's men put up a barn on a Saturday afternoon, and I can't—" She stopped. "I can't quite connect the 2 versions, like they happened in different places." "They didn't," Clara said. "They happened in the same place. The place changed." Margaret considered this. Did we change it, or did we just take away the thing that was stopping it from being what it was? Clara thought about that for a moment, watching Thomas Briggs across the yard, working with a focused energy that she had not seen in him since before the courthouse steps, since before the saloon floor, maybe since before any of this. "I think," she said, "both things can be true." Margaret nodded. Then she picked up what she'd set down and went back to work. And Clara did the same. And the afternoon wore on, and by evening there was a barn where there hadn't been one that morning. They ate together in the yard after, all of them, whatever had been brought, combined and shared without formal organization. And it was not comfortable in the way that easy friendships are comfortable. There was still too much recent history for that. Too many things that had happened that couldn't be unfelt. Thomas Briggs and Phelan Kellerman sat near each other but didn't talk much. 2 men who had been through something and hadn't yet figured out the language for it. Abel Marsh ate carefully and did not stay late because he tired easily now, though he would not have said so. Pete talked too much and meant well, and twice knocked something over. It was not a celebration. It was more like the first day of something that didn't have a name yet, which was in some ways better. Ronan sat beside Clara on the back of his wagon, and they didn't talk much either, and at some point his hand found hers in the dim light of the evening and stayed there, and she thought about the first day she had sat across from him at this ranch, when she had told him about her marriage and about learning to document things, and how he had said, "I'm sorry," and she had said, "Don't be," and how she had meant it because she did not believe in apologizing for the things that made you capable. She still didn't, but she thought now that capable was not the whole of it, that what she had been learning in Blackstone Crossing was not just how to use what she had already built in herself, the precision, the patience, the refusal to look away, but how to put it in the service of something larger than her own survival. That was the part she hadn't known she was missing. You can spend a long time being good at holding on and never learn to reach. She had reached. It had been terrifying and uncertain, and it had not always worked, and some of it was still unresolved and would probably remain unresolved in the particular ways that real things remain unresolved, trailing their complications behind them. She had reached anyway. In May, a letter arrived from Evelyn Harlan, Evelyn Marsh. Now she had taken back her family name, the letter said, which was the first thing she had done in Omaha, and which had felt, she wrote, like an unreasonably large thing for something that was just paperwork. The letter was 3 pages, written in that same small, precise handwriting Clara recognized from the signed statement on the kitchen table 5 months ago. Evelyn described her niece, who was 6 and apparently fearless. She described her sister's house, which was crowded and noisy, and nothing like the large, quiet house she had lived in for 22 years, and which she was finding, to her own surprise, that she liked. She described a garden she was planning to start in the spring. She described a woman at the church social who had asked about her background, and how she had answered, and how it had felt to answer without calculating what she was and wasn't allowed to say. At the end, she wrote, "I don't know if you think about any of this. You seem like a person who finishes things and moves on, which I mean as a compliment, but I think about it often. I think about the fact that I sat in a kitchen in Blackstone Crossing and gave a piece of paper to a woman I had met once, and that piece of paper turned out to matter. It's a strange thing to sit with, but not an unpleasant one. I hope the ranch is well. I hope you are well. I hope you know what you did." Clara read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light, with the sound of the ranch beginning its day outside the windows. Horses, voices, Pete apparently explaining something to the younger hand who had been hired in February, in the particular patient tone Pete used when he was trying very hard not to sound like he didn't know what he was talking about. She folded the letter and held it for a moment. Then she opened the journal, the one that was hers, the second one, to the last page where she had written the final entry about the Kellermans going home, and she wrote one more thing. Not about an incident, not about a date or a time or a source or a piece of evidence. Just, "EM writes from Omaha. She is planting a garden. She says she hopes I know what I did. I'm not sure I do, fully. I know what we did. All of us who didn't look away. I know that looking away seemed like the easier thing at every step and wasn't, because nothing you run from stays still. It waits. And the thing about waiting problems is that they always get heavier the longer you carry them. I arrived here with $42 and a letter that called me stubborn. I do not have $42 anymore, and the letter is in the desk with the other things I keep, and the ranch is still standing. I think that is enough." She closed the journal and set it down. Outside, Ronan was crossing the yard. She could hear his footsteps on the boards of the porch, and then the door, and then he was in the kitchen with his coat still on and his boots dirty from the morning's work, and he looked at her at the table and the journal under her hands. "Finished?" he asked. She thought about what that meant, and all the things it didn't mean. The legal proceedings that still had their slow tail of motions and counterfilings, the north fence that had been repaired but would need watching, Pete's education in livestock accounting that would take approximately the rest of his natural life, the valley that was rebuilding itself not in a straight line, but in the complicated sideways manner of real communities that had been through something and were trying to figure out what they were on the other side of it. None of that was finished. "This part," she said, and touched the cover of the journal. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the May morning was doing what May mornings did out here, which was to make everything look like something worth keeping. She had arrived not knowing if she was staying. She was staying. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was, as it turned out, quite a lot.